aren't a lot of farms, there aren't a lot of small towns. So the normal ebb and flow of populations that we have in the United States and Canada, it's very different. Here, when a city starts to develop and really industrialize in a big way and get into manufacturing, they start drawing labor from other communities that are nearby. In northern Mexico, there are no other communities. So pros and cons. The pro is that there's usually just a handful of families who run the entire metro, and that metro stops at the edge of the desert, and that's it. Now, that means that as a American, you can go south with your needs, find out who's in charge, make friends, and you will probably leave in a few days with a series of supply contracts because they represent the power board, the mayor's office, the tax office, the university, the local labor unions. It's all in one little package. It's very oligarchic. We don't like that here, but wow, is it easy to interface with when you want to do business. You'll leave with those deals, probably a godchild and absolutely a splitting hangover because you're part of the family now. And the Texans have been doing this for 30 years. But once you've gobbled up all the labor for each metro, you're done. The Mexicans aren't mobile like we are because they don't have those secondary communities in the north. Well, there's only 130 million Mexicans. About a quarter of those are in the northern states that we have the most experience with. And I would argue that the Texans have already gobbled up about 70 to 75% of that labor. So there's a limited window for everyone else to get in on northern Mexico where the logistics are simpler, where the politics are simpler. Once that is gobbled up, and at the rate we're going, that's in less than 2 or 3 years, we then have to go into central Mexico, which is a much different environment. And now you're dealing with people like AMLO. Now you're dealing with not so much oligarchs, but a more connected community that has its own weight. It's not that that can't be productive. It's wildly productive, but it's a much more complicated launch process that requires a lot more negotiation and a lot more government involvement.
So Peter, you sound incredibly bullish on North America.
Mm-hmm.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about this transition to EVs. So is it?
Oh, I thought you were going to say Canada. Okay, yeah, sure. EVs.
No, electric vehicles in terms of the transition, which we don't have a lot of those materials here.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that?
Yeah, it's not going to happen is a short version.
Okay.
It just can't happen. Leaving aside the processing question, which is a 2-year fix, Russia is one of the world's top 3 suppliers of copper, of nickel, of cobalt, and of aluminum. And all of those are going to zero. So we're going to be in a position very soon where we have to decide which parts of the green transition are worth doing because we will not have the materials to even attempt all of them. Greening the grid, just greening the grid and putting up a bunch of wind and solar, that's going to expand the size of the grid by at least half, probably double. EVs would be another doubling. And if you're looking at this on a carbon production transition period, putting up a wind tower, assuming you put it in a place where the wind blows, important detail, obviously has an immediate carbon impact. An EV does not, because an EV draws from the grid in its current form, and for the most part, the processing facilities required to build the EV on the first place are incredibly carbon intensive. And most vehicles running on most grids are going to take in excess of a decade to pay back the carbon debt. Data for heavier equipment, things like semis or forklifts or whatever, it doesn't exist yet because those products don't exist yet, but it's probably 2 to 3 decades.
So what does this mean in terms of when we have to get our energy here in the United States, to obviously deliver freight, to survive? We have such a focus on green transition. We saw what happened. We've seen what's happened in Europe. How do we navigate this?
We need to break down through in material science before we do it at scale for transport. Now, the United States and the Great Plains has the world's best wind zone, and the American Southwest from roughly central California down to central Texas is the second best solar zone. I'm not suggesting we can't do any of it, but I'm suggesting that in a constrained environment where we have to make choices because the inputs are limited, I'm just saying that EVs in their current form will not make the cut.
And you said, obviously, semis take so much more battery power.
Assuming they work, which we don't know yet.
Right. Well, we hope to find out this year when
200,000, right? By the end of the year, right? Whew.
Yeah, he's got a big hurdle. Peter, inflation has been a big topic, continues to be a big topic. In a world where globalization is shifting or ending, or we're deglobalizing, whatever the appropriate term is, what does that mean from an inflationary standpoint?
Oh, yeah, I got an answer for that. You're not going to like it. Okay, so we've got labor pressure at all points. Chinese manufacturers are going away. German manufacturers are going away. Russian materials are going away. The boomers may be retiring, but the millennials, their kids, are at the height of their consumption, suggesting a return to the inflation that we had in the 70s and 80s. And we need to double the size of the industrial plant at the same time. Every disinflationary trend of the last 75 years has flipped, and every inflationary trend is back all at the same time. We are looking at 9 to 15% inflation for at least the next 5 years. That's hardwired in. That's independent of anything the Fed does. That's just reacting to the strategic overall structural environment. Now, at the end of that 5-year period, if we have succeeded in building out the industrial plant, we go back to a much tamer system that will be lower for longer because the supply chains will be local, the materials processing will be local, and we'll be following our own labor metrics, which will have evolved because we'll have had to do a lot more with AI and a lot more with automation than we currently have, especially as we bring in things like electronics manufacturing. We won't have a choice. If we fail to do that, then the 9 to 15% inflation continues, and we have product shortages. It's, from my point of view, it's a really clear path, because the alternative is just to go through the worst of it and get none of the benefits.
So you're suggesting what Jay Powell is trying to do right now is just a lost cause?
I hesitate to criticize policymakers, especially when they're in difficult environments. He's using the tools he has to deal with the problem he understands. The issue is where we're moving is not just a problem of demand, it's more of a problem of supply. And until we've built out the replacement supplies, we don't have monetary policy that is capable of dealing with the issue that we're struggling with. He's using the tool that he has, which regulates demand. He's trying to get inflation under control. I understand that because high inflation over a long period of time wrecks productive capacity in the long run. But ultimately, productive capacity is what we have to build out. That is primarily a job for fiscal policy. And on that, we've had 2, 3, 4. We had 4 presidents in a row who were on fiscal policy. Biden is by far the most pragmatic of the bunch. And while there are a lot of things, especially in energy, that I'm like, that's really a horrible idea. For the first time in 14 years now, we actually have a president who's trying to enact policy, which is kind of novel from my point of view. We actually have a guy who's president who actually seems to want to be president for a change. And we are getting bits and pieces of what is adding up to an industrial policy. And I might not agree with all of the pieces of it. I certainly don't. But seeing someone try, I give points for.
So, Peter, sort of closing thoughts. I'd like to leave here a little bit more optimistic for the folks that are in the room that are building the technology around the future of supply chain, freight. What should they be thinking about investing in that their businesses can benefit from this shift back to North America?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you want to play the political card, start lobbying your Congress people to reform Jones.